Ever wondered how a single nation ended up as two contentious entities? It's time to delve into the Korean War. This conflict, which spanned from 1950 to 1953, originated from a division that arose in the aftermath of World War II. Following the end of World War II, Korea, once under Japanese rule, was divided at the 38th parallel, a line of latitude that approximately bisects the peninsula. This division was more than geographical. It symbolized a stark ideological contrast between the two newly established governments. To the north of this imaginary line, a communist state began to take shape under the guidance of Kim Il-sung. With the backing of the Soviet Union and China, North Korea sought to extend its ideology to the south. Conversely, to the south of the 38th parallel, a capitalist state emerged under the leadership of Syngman Rhee, supported by the United States and its Western allies. As these two contrasting ideologies solidified, the 38th parallel became more than a line on a map. It was a political and ideological fault line, with each side claiming to be the legitimate government of all Korea. With the passage of time, the tension along the 38th parallel intensified. Skirmishes and clashes became commonplace, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty and fear. The border region, a symbol of the division of a once unified nation, had become a volatile flashpoint. By the summer of 1950, the situation had reached a boiling point. The ideological differences, the political posturing, and the border clashes all coalesced into a full-fledged conflict. The Korean War, as we know it today, was about to begin. This was a time of political turmoil and escalating tensions, setting the stage for what was to come. June 25, 1950, a date that ignited a war like no other. On this fateful day, the North Korean People's Army crossed the 38th parallel, the invisible line that had been drawn to separate North and South Korea at the end of World War II. This invasion was not just a simple border skirmish. It was a full-scale assault, a declaration of war that would soon involve the international community in a conflict that would rage for 3 long years. The North Korean forces, supported by Soviet tanks and aircraft, quickly overran the ill-prepared South Korean army. Seizing control of the capital, Seoul, within just 3 days, the invaders rapidly advanced southward. The world watched in shock as South Korea was pushed to the brink of collapse. However, this blatant act of aggression did not go unanswered. The United Nations Security Council, in a historic move, invoked its military enforcement power for the first time. It called upon its member nations to come to the aid of South Korea. 16 member nations answered the call, with troops, medical units, or other forms of support. The United States, under the leadership of President Harry Truman, was the chief contributor, providing the bulk of the military forces. The entry of these international forces into the conflict was a game-changer. They brought with them not just their military might, but also a firm resolve to uphold the principles of the United Nations, to maintain international peace and security, and to repel armed aggression. The Korean War was no longer just a civil conflict. It had become an international war, a test of the United Nations' resolve, and a stark reminder of the precarious balance of power in the post-World War II world. The early days of the war were marked by swift and brutal advances, desperate defenses, and the rallying of an international coalition. Yet, as the world would soon discover, this was just the beginning. The Korean War was far from over. What was initially a civil conflict was quickly escalating into an international war. In warfare, the situation can change rapidly, and the Korean War was no exception. When we delve into the heart of the Korean conflict, we find that the tide of the war was undeniably influenced by a series of pivotal events. One such event was the Incheon landing, a daring amphibious invasion led by General Douglas MacArthur in September 1950. This audacious operation turned the tide of the war, enabling the United Nations forces to recapture Seoul, the capital of South Korea, and push the North Korean troops back to the 38th parallel. The boldness of this move caught the North Korean forces off guard, disrupting their supply lines and forcing them into a hasty retreat. However, just as the United Nations forces were reveling in their success, the war took another unexpected turn. As they pushed further into North Korean territory nearing the Yalu River, a new player entered the fray. China, feeling threatened by the proximity of UN forces to its borders, decided to enter the war on the side of North Korea in October 1950. The Chinese entry was a game-changer. With fresh troops and a fierce determination, they launched a massive counter-offensive. The UN forces, taken by surprise, were pushed back significantly. It was a harsh winter, and the cold took as much of a toll as the fighting. The war, which had seemed to be tilting in favor of the UN, was now back in a state of flux, with the front lines shifting back and forth across the 38th parallel. The Korean War was a conflict of ebb and flow, of advances and retreats. It was a war where the situation could change in the blink of an eye, where the scales could tip in favor of one side, only to swing back just as quickly. The war's momentum had swung back and forth, with neither side gaining a decisive advantage. The war had reached a stalemate, but the end was nowhere in sight. The Korean War, following a series of dramatic turns, had come to a standstill by the close of 1951. The opposing sides were entrenched along the 38th parallel, a line of latitude that had once served as a mere political boundary but had now become the literal line in the sand. For 2 grueling years, both sides faced off in a bitter contest of wills and weaponry. The landscape was scarred by the endless trench warfare, with soldiers on both sides living in a state of perpetual readiness. The specter of death was a constant companion in this no-man's land, where the only certainty was uncertainty. As the stalemate dragged on, the focus began to shift from the battlefield to the negotiation table. Armistice talks began in July of 1951, but progress was painstakingly slow. The discussions were fraught with contention and disagreement, mirroring the very conflict they sought to resolve. Despite the challenges, the talks moved forward, inching towards the possibility of peace. The negotiations would take 2 long years, with both sides wrestling over the terms and conditions of a potential armistice agreement. The discussions were as much a test of endurance as the war itself, with every point and counterpoint carrying the weight of thousands of lives. Finally, in July of 1953, after 2 years of intense negotiations, the Korean Armistice Agreement was signed. The agreement established a demilitarized zone along the 38th parallel, effectively ending the active hostilities. But it was an uneasy peace, a cessation rather than a resolution. While the guns fell silent, the war was technically not over, merely paused. The Armistice Agreement was just that, an armistice, not a peace treaty. The Korean War, in a sense, remains unresolved to this day, a silent testament to a conflict that has shaped the course of history. The Korean War left a profound impact on the peninsula and the world. The aftermath was nothing short of devastating. Cities and towns across the Korean peninsula lay in ruins. Infrastructure was decimated, and the economy, once vibrant and growing, was brought to its knees. The human cost was even more staggering. An estimated 2 million civilians lost their lives, forever altering the fabric of Korean society. But the war's legacy extended far beyond the physical destruction. It sowed seeds of division that persist to this day. North and South Korea, once united by language and culture, were now split along ideological lines, a divide that remains as deep and as wide as ever. The demilitarized zone, a stark 4-kilometer-wide strip of land stretching across the peninsula, stands as a concrete manifestation of this enduring schism. The ramifications of the Korean War were felt not just on the peninsula but also on the global stage. It marked a turning point in the Cold War, intensifying the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. The war set a precedent for American military intervention in the name of containing communism, a strategy that would come to define U.S. foreign policy for decades to come. In the aftermath, Korea became a battleground for competing ideologies, each side backed by a global superpower. The North, under the influence of the Soviet Union and China, embraced communism. The South, supported by the United States, adopted a capitalist system. This ideological clash continues to shape the geopolitics of the region and the world. The Korean War, a conflict that shaped the course of history, remains a poignant reminder of the costs of war. Its legacy is a stark testament to the destructive power of ideological conflict and the human capacity for resilience and recovery. As we reflect on this pivotal period in history, let's remember the lessons it has taught us and strive for a future where such conflicts are a thing of the past. So, we've journeyed through the Korean War, from its origins to its ongoing legacy. We've seen the division of Korea, the eruption of conflict, and the international forces that joined the fray. We've explored the deadlock that led to an armistice, and the lasting impact of this war on the Korean peninsula and the world. This journey through history has been enlightening, hasn't it? Remember to like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more insightful content. Until next time, keep exploring history.